Grizzly bear carried lost baby to cabin door. Man's shocking reaction stunned everyone. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed like silent sentinels over Raven's Peak, a rugged speck of a settlement buried deep in Nevada's wild heart. Winter had descended with a vengeance, and tonight a blizzard roared through the pines, whipping snow into a blinding curtain that swallowed the world whole. At the edge of this frozen nowhere stood Jack Malone's ranger station, an old log cabin patched together with grit and time, its single window glowing faintly against the storm's wrath. Inside, Jack sat hunched by the fireplace, the crackling logs throwing shadows across his weathered face. At 45, he was a man carved from the mountains themselves, broad-shouldered, gray creeping into his dark hair, eyes sharp but dulled by years of solitude. He'd built this life to escape. 5 tours in Afghanistan had left him with scars he didn't talk about, and when the last one ended with an ambush that took his squad, he'd walked away from everything. Raven's Peak was his fortress, a place where the ghosts couldn't follow, or so he thought. The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters, and Jack sipped from a tin mug of black coffee, the bitter heat grounding him. Then came the sound, a heavy thud against the door, followed by a sharp, insistent scratching that cut through the storm's howl like a blade. Jack froze, his hand tightening around the mug. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting it down with a clink. He'd heard plenty in these woods, coyotes, wind-tossed branches. But this was different, deliberate. A low rumble followed, not quite a growl, and his pulse kicked up a notch. He grabbed the rifle propped against the wall, an old Winchester he kept more for habit than need, and edged toward the door, his boots scuffing the creaky floorboards. The scratching grew frantic, clawing at the wood, and Jack hesitated, his breath clouding in the chilly air. Bear? He thought, picturing some half-starved beast driven mad by the cold. But then he heard it, a faint, pitiful cry, human and small, piercing the night. He flung the door open, the wind slamming into him like a fist, and what he saw stopped him dead. A grizzly bear, massive, its brown fur crusted with snow, stood on his porch, its bulk filling the doorway. The beast's eyes glowed in the firelight, deep and unnervingly intelligent, locked on Jack with a purpose that made his skin crawl. On its back, cradled in a torn blanket, was a baby, a tiny shivering thing, its cries weak against the storm's roar. Jack's jaw dropped, the rifle slipping in his grip. "Holy shit," he breathed, the words lost in the wind. The bear didn't lunge or snarl. Instead, it moved with a gentleness that defied its size, lowering its head to slide the baby onto the snow-dusted porch. The infant's face was flushed red, lips blue from the cold, bundled in a rag of wool that barely held together. Then, in a move that turned Jack's world upside down, the grizzly raised a massive paw and waved, actually waved like some damn cartoon character, before clawing at the door again, gouging deep scratches into the wood. It wasn't a threat, it was a plea. Those eyes, dark and desperate, seemed to say, "Take her, save her." Jack's mind reeled, years of combat instincts warring with sheer disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, but the baby's cries snapped him out of it. He dropped to his knees, scooping the little bundle into his arms, the rifle clattering to the floor. "Get in here," he yelled, waving at the bear, figuring if it was crazy enough to bring a kid, it might as well come inside. But the grizzly didn't move, just stood there, steam rising from its fur, watching him with a stillness that felt ancient, almost sacred. Jack kicked the door wider, the hinges groaning, and stumbled back into the cabin, slamming it shut against the storm. He staggered to the fireplace, his boots leaving wet tracks, and set the baby on the rug, peeling back the soaked blanket. She was tiny, 2 months old maybe, her dark lashes crusted with frost, her breath shallow but stubborn. "Hang on, kid," he said, his voice rough with urgency. He grabbed a dry quilt from the couch, wrapping it around her, and rubbed her tiny hands between his calloused palms. The fire's warmth washed over them, and her cries grew louder, a spark of life that hit him like a punch. He glanced back at the door, half expecting the bear to barge in, but it was gone, vanished into the whiteout, leaving only its tracks and a mystery he couldn't wrap his head around. Jack sank onto the rug, staring at the baby's face. A star winked through the frosted window, bright against the storm, and he decided to call her Stella. Something about that light felt right. "What the hell were you doing out there, Stella?" he murmured, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. The Grizzly's wave played over in his mind, absurd and haunting, a gesture so human it chilled him to the bone. He'd seen a lot: war, death, the raw edge of survival. But nothing like this. Whatever that bear was, it wasn't just some animal. It had brought her here, to him, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident. The wind howled louder, rattling the cabin, but inside the fire crackled with a steady promise. Jack rocked Stella gently, her cries softening into whimpers, and stared at the door where the bear had stood. "Titan," he muttered, naming the grizzly in his head, a name fit for something that big, that strange. He didn't know why Titan had picked his doorstep or what waited out there in the snow, but one thing was clear. This night had changed everything, and Jack Malone was in deeper than he'd ever imagined. The blizzard pounded Raven's Peak with unrelenting fury, the wind clawing at the ranger station's old log walls like it wanted to rip them apart. Inside, Jack Malone knelt by the fireplace, the glow of the embers painting his rugged face in shades of orange and shadow. Little Stella lay bundled in a quilt on the rug, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steadiness that eased the tightness in Jack's throat. The cabin smelled of burning pine and damp wool, a fragile bubble of warmth against the chaos outside. He'd been alone here for years, 5, maybe 6, since he'd walked away from the army. But tonight, solitude had shattered, replaced by a baby and the ghost of a grizzly's impossible plea. Jack rubbed his hands together, the calluses scraping rough against each other, and glanced at Stella. Her cries had quieted, her lips parting in soft, sleepy breaths, but her skin was still cold to the touch. "Gotta get you warmed up proper," he muttered, his voice gravelly from disuse. He stood, joints popping, and shuffled to the kitchen nook, a cluttered corner with a dented stove and a shelf of mismatched supplies. He grabbed a pot, filled it with water from a jug, and set it over the fire, watching the flames lick at the metal. Babies needed milk, right? He rummaged through a crate of emergency gear, digging past bandages and batteries until he found a dusty can of powdered formula. "Expired last year," he grunted, checking the date. "But it'll do." He mixed it with the warm water in a tin cup, the sweet smell hitting him like a memory he didn't own. Back by the hearth, he knelt beside Stella, cradling her awkwardly in one arm. She stirred, her dark eyes fluttering open for the first time, big, curious, staring up at him like she was sizing him up. "Hey there, kid," he said, tipping the cup to her lips. She latched on, sucking hungrily, her tiny hands flailing in the quilt. Jack watched, a flicker of relief washing over him as color crept back into her cheeks. "That's it," he murmured, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. It was clumsy as hell. He hadn't held a baby since his nephew was born, decades ago. But she drank, and that was enough. He set the cup aside, rocking her gently, and glanced at the door. The grizzly, Titan, hadn't come back, but its tracks lingered in his mind, deep gouges in the snow and that eerie wave, like something out of a fever dream. Jack wasn't a man who spooked easy. War had burned that out of him. But this was different. He'd seen bears up close, tracked them when he first took the ranger gig, but none had ever looked at him like that, like they were asking for help. "What were you doing out there, big guy?" he said aloud, his voice bouncing off the walls. Stella cooed, her hand brushing his thumb, and he felt a pang, part awe, part dread. He laid her back in the quilt, tucking it tight, and grabbed the wet blanket Titan had brought her in. It was heavy, stiff with ice, and as he unfolded it, something crinkled. A scrap of paper, crumpled and stained with dried blood. He smoothed it out, squinting in the firelight. "Stella, 2 months. Keep her safe." The words were shaky, scrawled in haste, and that blood smear sent a chill down his spine. "Keep her safe from what?" he muttered, turning the note over, finding nothing else. He'd seen combat memos, frantic scribbles from dying men. This felt like that, a last stand on paper. Jack stood, pacing the small room, his boots thudding against the floorboards. He'd come to Raven's Peak to hide, from the army, from the screams of his squad, from the guilt of surviving when they didn't. 5 years ago, he'd been pinned down in a dusty valley, watching his brothers bleed out while he dragged the last one to cover. He'd failed them, walked away from the medals and the pity, and built this cabin to keep the world out. Now here he was, a baby in his care, and a grizzly playing delivery boy. "Why me?" he growled, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm no damn hero." The fire popped, a sharp crack that made him flinch, and he glanced at Stella, then at the window. The storm was a white wall, but he wiped the frost with his sleeve, peering out. Nothing, just snow and shadows, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Titan was still out there, watching. He turned back to the note, his jaw tightening. That blood wasn't from the cold. It was fresh when it dried, a sign of violence, not accident. He'd seen enough in the war to know the difference. Someone had fought to get Stella here, and Titan had finished the job. He sank into the armchair, cradling the rifle across his lap, his mind churning. The army had taught him to read signs, tracks, blood, intent, and this screamed trouble. He didn't want it, didn't ask for it, but those eyes, Titan's eyes, had picked him out of the dark. "You're stuck with me now, kid," he said, looking at Stella, her tiny chest rising under the quilt. "But I don't know what I'm up against." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the door. The wind shifted, a mournful howl that carried a faint, unnatural hum, mechanical, distant, but growing closer. Jack's head snapped up, his grip tightening on the rifle. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, standing slowly. The hum wasn't the wind. It was something else, something alive in the storm. He crossed to the window again, squinting into the whiteout, but saw only snow. Still the sound lingered, a whisper of danger that set his nerves on edge. He turned back to Stella, then to the empty space where Titan had stood, and made a decision, a soldier's decision, born of instinct and grit. "Whoever's out there," he said, his voice low and hard, "they're not getting you, not while I'm breathing." The cabin creaked around him, a fortress under siege, and Jack Malone knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a baby and a bear anymore. It was a fight, and he was in it whether he liked it or not. The storm battered Raven's Peak with a ferocity that seemed personal, the wind howling through the Sierra Nevada pines like a chorus of lost souls. Inside the ranger station, Jack Malone sat by the flickering fireplace, the glow casting jagged shadows across the log walls. Little Stella slept fitfully in her quilt, her tiny breaths a soft counterpoint to the chaos outside. The bloody note, "Stella, 2 months, keep her safe," lay crumpled on the floor beside him, its words burned into his mind. Jack's eyes drifted to the window, where frost obscured the view, but beyond it, he could still see them in his head. The massive paw prints of the Grizzly, Titan, etched deep into the snow, leading away from his porch into the white abyss. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and rubbed his stubbled jaw, his thoughts churning. That bear wasn't just some wild animal. It had waved at him for Christ's sake, like it knew what it was doing. Jack had tracked bears in these mountains, seen them lumber through the brush, but none had ever looked at him with that kind of purpose, that raw intelligence. "Who are you, Titan?" he muttered, his voice a low growl lost in the fire's hum. The grizzly's tracks haunted him, a trail he couldn't follow but couldn't ignore. And as he stared at the door where it had stood, his mind slipped back to the hours before that impossible moment, piecing together a story only the snow and the bear could tell. Titan wasn't a stranger to these woods. For years, the locals in Raven's Peak had whispered about Mountain Soul, a grizzly bigger than most, with a coat dark as pine bark and eyes that seemed to see right through you. Jack had dismissed it as bar talk, the kind of yarn spun over cheap whiskey, but he'd heard the tales. A bear that didn't raid camps or attack livestock, a shadow that moved like it owned the forest. Titan had carved out a life in a deep cave high on the ridge, a solitary king watching over the Sierra Nevada. its instincts honed by decades of survival in a land that didn't forgive mistakes. That night, as the blizzard swept in, Titan had been hunkered in its den, the wind whistling through the stone walls. The storm was nothing new. Grizzlies weathered worse. But something pulled it out into the cold. A sound, sharp and wrong, cutting through the gale. A mechanical roar, brief and stuttering, followed by a scream. Human, desperate, swallowed fast by the snow. Titan's ears pricked, its massive head lifting, and it lumbered out of the cave, paws sinking into the drifts as it followed the echo down the mountainside. Half a mile from Jack's station, it found the source. A snowmobile, its sleek frame twisted and half buried under a fresh slide of snow at the base of a steep ravine. The air stank of gasoline and blood, a bitter mix that stung Titan's nose. It circled the wreck, growling low, its breath steaming in the frigid dark until it saw her. A young woman, maybe 25, slumped against the wreckage, her arms wrapped tight around a bundle. Her face was pale, her dark hair matted with ice, a gash across her temple leaking red into the snow. She was dead, her body stiffening in the cold. But the bundle moved, a faint whimper rising from it like a beacon. Titan nosed at the blanket, pulling it back with a gentleness that belied its size, revealing Stella, 2 months old, her tiny face pinched with cold, her cries weak but stubborn. The grizzly's ears flattened, a rumble vibrating in its chest as it scanned the ravine. Another scent hit it, human, male, sharp with sweat and fear. Footprints, deep and uneven, staggered away from the wreck, leading into the trees. A man, maybe her father, fleeing into the storm. Beside the tracks, a glint caught Titan's eye. A pistol, half buried in the snow, its barrel stained with blood. This wasn't an accident. It was a fight, a betrayal, and the man had run, leaving the woman and child behind. Titan didn't hesitate. It hooked its jaws around the blanket, lifting Stella onto its broad back with a care that defied its nature. The baby's weight was nothing to a beast that could topple trees, but the cold was a killer, seeping into its bones as it turned toward the only light it knew. A faint glow cutting through the pines, Jack's ranger station, 2 miles down the valley. The storm fought at every step, wind slashing at its fur, snow piling up to its chest. But Titan pushed on, its massive paws carving a path through the drifts. Twice it stumbled, its growl lost in the gale, and twice it rose, shaking off the ice, Stella's cries driving it forward like a mission etched into its marrow. The journey took hours, hours of raw animal will against a blizzard that would have killed a lesser creature. Titan's breath came in ragged bursts, its muscles screaming, but it didn't stop until it reached Jack's porch. It slid Stella onto the snow, her cries fading, and raised a paw, waving, a gesture it had seen humans use, a plea it couldn't voice. It clawed at the door, gouging the wood, barking a deep, rumbling call until the latch clicked and Jack appeared, rifle in hand, eyes wide with shock. Back in the cabin, Jack blinked, the imagined trek fading as he stared at the frost-covered window. The fire snapped, a log splitting in the heat, and he ran a hand through his hair, piecing it together. "You didn't just find her, did you?" he said, his voice thick. "You saved her from something, someone." He glanced at Stella, then at the note, the blood smear glaring back at him. Titan hadn't wandered onto his porch by chance. It had chosen him, a soldier turned recluse, to finish what it couldn't. He stood crossing to the door and cracked it open, the wind stinging his face as he studied the tracks, deep, deliberate, vanishing into the storm. "You're out there, aren't you?" he whispered, feeling the grizzly's presence like a weight in the air. The snow stretched endless before him, hiding secrets he couldn't yet see. But Jack knew one thing. Titan's journey had been a rescue, a desperate handoff, and whatever it had run from was still out there, waiting in the white. The storm clung to Raven's Peak like a curse, its fury unrelenting as day 3 dawned gray and cold. Inside the ranger station, Jack Malone sat by the fire, the embers glowing a dull red against the log walls. Stella slept in her makeshift cradle, a crate he'd lined with an old sleeping bag, her tiny face peaceful under the quilt. The cabin hummed with a strange new rhythm. Her soft breaths, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional creak of the wind-battered roof. Jack rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights weighing on him. But there was something else too, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt since before the war, a fragile thread tying him to the baby and the grizzly that had brought her here. He'd named the bear Titan, and it fit. Big, unyielding, a force of nature that didn't bow to blizzards or bullets. Last night, it had come back, a shadow in the snow, standing silently outside the window. Jack had cracked the door, rifle in hand, half expecting it to charge, but Titan just stared, its eyes glinting in the firelight, then turned and melted into the dark. "What do you want, big guy?" Jack had muttered, but he knew. It was watching, waiting, guarding something he couldn't yet grasp. Now he knelt beside Stella, adjusting the quilt around her. She stirred, her dark eyes opening, and gave him a gummy smile that hit him like a shot. "Morning, kid," he said, his voice rough but soft. He'd rigged a bottle from a canteen and some formula, and she took it eagerly, her tiny hands clutching at the air. Jack hummed an old army tune, off-key, gravelly, and watched her drink, a grin tugging at his mouth. "You're tougher than you look," he said, brushing her cheek with a calloused finger. It was clumsy, this caregiving, but it felt right, like a piece of him waking up after years of sleep. He glanced at the window, where Titan's tracks still marked the snow, a reminder of the night it had waved, clawed his door, and handed Stella over. That image wouldn't leave him, replaying like a war memory he couldn't shake. He'd started talking to Titan in his head, then out loud, the words spilling out as he worked. "Seen some shit in my day," he said, stoking the fire with a poker. "Lost my squad in a dust bowl half a world away. Thought I'd left all that behind." He paused, the flames dancing in his eyes. "Guess you've got your own battles, huh?" The grizzly wasn't there to hear it, but Jack felt its presence anyway, a silent partner in this mess. He grabbed Stella's damp blanket from the floor, smoothing it out to dry by the fire, and something caught his eye, a glint of metal tucked in the folds. He tugged it free, a bullet, small caliber, its casing scratched but intact. His stomach dropped. "What the hell?" he muttered, turning it over in his fingers. This wasn't from a crash. It was fired, lodged in the wool like a warning. He'd seen enough combat to know a gunshot wound when he smelled one, and that bloody note, "Keep her safe," suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't just a lost kid. It was a survivor of something ugly. Jack stood, pacing the room, his boots pounding the wood. Raven's Peak wasn't pristine. Rumors floated around town about smugglers running guns, or worse, through the Sierra Nevada, using the mountains as cover. He'd ignored it, kept his head down, but now it stared him in the face. "Someone shot at you, didn't they?" he said, glancing at Stella. "And Titan got you out." The grizzly's wave, its clawing at the door, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, a handover from one protector to another. He crossed to the radio, an old military relic on the shelf, and fiddled with the dials. Static hissed, the storm scrambling the signal, but he patched together a weak message. "Raven's Peak Station to base. Found a kid. Possible trouble. Need backup." He didn't know if it went through, didn't know who'd hear it, but he couldn't sit still. He grabbed the Winchester, checking the chamber, his soldier's instincts roaring back to life. "If they're coming for you, they'll have to get through me," he said, his voice hard. The fire popped, and Stella cooed, drawing his attention. He set the rifle down, lifting her into his arms, her weight a steady anchor. "You're stuck with me now, kid," he murmured, rocking her gently. Outside, Titan appeared again, a massive shape in the snow, standing by the porch, its eyes locked on the window. Jack met its gaze, a silent pact passing between them. "You're out there keeping watch, aren't you?" he said, his breath fogging the glass. The bear didn't move, just stared, its presence a promise and a challenge. Then came the sound, a low hum, mechanical, cutting through the wind's wail. Jack's head snapped up, his grip tightening on Stella. "What the hell is that?" he growled, crossing to the window. The snow was a white wall, but the hum grew louder, closer. Not a rescue team, not with that edge of menace. Titan shifted outside, ears twitching, a rumble rising in its chest. Jack's pulse raced, his mind flashing to the bullet, the blood, the smugglers. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice cold as steel. He turned to Titan's silhouette, then to Stella, and made a vow, a soldier's vow, born of fire and grit. "We're in this together, big guy. Let's see who's dumb enough to try." The hum swelled, a shadow moving in the storm, and Jack Malone braced for a fight he hadn't signed up for, but wouldn't back down from. The storm over Raven's Peak had softened by the fourth night, its relentless roar fading into a low, mournful hum that seeped through the ranger station's log walls. Inside, Jack Malone sat by the dying fire, the embers casting a faint glow across his weathered face. Stella slept in her crate, her tiny chest rising and falling under the quilt, her soft breaths a fragile thread tying him to this strange new reality. The Winchester rifle lay across his lap, its cold steel a comfort against the unease that had settled into his bones. The bullet he'd found in her blanket, small, scratched, a silent witness to violence, sat heavy in his pocket, a reminder that this wasn't just a rescue story anymore. Outside, the snow stretched endless, hiding secrets he could feel closing in. Jack rubbed his eyes, the exhaustion of 4 sleepless nights clawing at him, when a sound shattered the stillness. A deep, guttural roar from the porch, raw and urgent. Titan. He bolted upright, rifle in hand, as the Grizzly's massive shape filled the window, its fur bristling, eyes blazing in the dim light. The bear reared up, slamming its paws against the glass, a thunderous crack splitting the air before it leapt into the darkness, snarling into the storm. Jack's pulse hammered. "What the hell's out there?" he growled, crossing to the door in 2 strides. He flung it open, the wind stinging his face, and saw Titan charging into the snow, a black shadow against the white, teeth bared, a force unleashed. Then he saw it, a figure, human, cloaked in white camouflage, moving fast through the drifts. The man's face was hidden behind a hood, but the glint of a rifle with a suppressor caught the firelight, its barrel trained on Titan. Jack's soldier instincts kicked in, his grip tightening on the Winchester. "Hey!" he shouted, stepping onto the porch. But before he could aim, Titan lunged. The Grizzly collided with the man in a blur of fur and fury, a guttural roar echoing as they tumbled into the snow. The rifle fired, a muffled crack, and Titan staggered, blood blooming dark against its shoulder, but it didn't stop. It swiped with a massive paw, sending the man sprawling, his weapon skidding across the ice. Jack raised his rifle, heart pounding, but Titan was already on the move, dragging itself into the trees, leaving a trail of crimson in the snow. The man scrambled up, cursing under his breath, and bolted after the bear, vanishing into the whiteout. Jack started to follow, boots crunching, when something glinted near the porch. A small black device dropped in the scuffle. He snatched it up, its edges slick with frost, and pressed a button. A voice crackled through, cold and clipped. "Erase the kid. The mother knows too much. Don't let that damn bear live." The words hit him like a freight train. Jack's breath caught, his mind racing as he stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and barring it with a plank. "The mother knows too much," he whispered, staring at the device. Then at Stella, her tiny form oblivious in her crate. The snowmobile wreck, the bloody note, Titan's desperate delivery. It wasn't just a rescue. Stella's mother was alive, out there somewhere, and Titan was protecting her. That man wasn't a hunter. He was a killer, sent to tie up loose ends, and the Grizzly had just taken a bullet to stop him. Jack sank to the floor, Stella's crate beside him, and replayed the message in his head. Erase the kid. Someone wanted her dead, someone with resources, with silencers and snow-camouflaged assassins. The bullet in the blanket, the rumors of smugglers in the Sierra Nevada. It clicked now, a jagged puzzle snapping into place. Stella's mother wasn't a lost hiker. She was a witness, a threat to something big, and Titan had risked everything to keep her baby safe. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the rifle, his soldier's mind kicking into overdrive. "You're not just a bear, are you?" he muttered, picturing Titan's intelligent eyes, its wave, its clawing at the door. You're in this deeper than me. A new sound cut through the night, a low mechanical rumble, faint but growing, vibrating through the cabin's walls. Jack's head snapped up, his stomach dropping. He staggered to the window, wiping the frost, and saw lights. 2, then 3, red and pulsing, slicing through the snow like predator eyes. Snowmobiles moving fast, closing in. They're here, he breathed, his voice tight with dread. He scooped Stella into his arms, her soft whimpers breaking the silence, and checked the rifle's chamber. "Hang on, kid," he said, pressing her close. "We've got company." The rumble grew louder, engines snarling through the storm, and then a roar, primal and fierce, erupting from the trees. Titan. Jack peered out, heart in his throat, and saw the Grizzly burst from the pines, blood streaming from its shoulder, charging straight at the lights. The snowmobiles swerved, their riders shouting, but Titan didn't falter. It slammed into the lead machine, a crash of metal and snow, sending it spinning into a drift. Gunshots rang out, sharp staccato pops, and Titan roared again, staggering but unrelenting, a wall of fury between the killers and the cabin. Jack's breath fogged the glass, his mind racing. "You're leading me to her, aren't you?" he said, his voice trembling with realization. Stella's mother, alive, hidden, guarded by this impossible bear. The Grizzly's roar faded into a pained growl, and Jack saw it limp back into the trees, the snowmobiles regrouping, their lights flickering. He turned to Stella, her dark eyes wide, and made a choice. A soldier's choice, forged in fire and blood. "They're not taking you," he said, his tone hard as steel, "and I'm not letting Titan fight alone." He grabbed a flashlight, strapped Stella to his chest with a makeshift harness, and slung the rifle over his shoulder. The radio crackled, static, then a faint voice. "Ravens Peak base to Malone. Back up en route." Jack didn't wait to see if it was real. He kicked the door open, the wind slamming into him, and stepped into the storm. Titan's trail a bloody lifeline in the snow. "Hold on, big guy," he whispered, his voice lost in the gale. "We're coming for her, and we're ending this." The storm broke over Ravens Peak as dawn painted the Sierra Nevada in shades of gold, the snow glistening under a sky finally free of clouds. Jack Malone trudged through the drifts, Stella strapped to his chest, her tiny form bundled tight against the cold. The Winchester hung heavy on his shoulder, its barrel still warm from the night's fight. Titan's bloody tracks led him, a jagged path through the pines, a testament to the Grizzly's unbreakable will. Behind him, the ranger station smoldered, its porch scarred from the battle that had unfolded just hours before. The air was still, the silence profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots and Stella's soft coos. The snowmobiles had come fast, 3 of them, their riders cloaked in white, faces hidden behind goggles, rifles spitting fire into the night. Jack had met them head-on, Titan at his side, a soldier and a bear against an enemy they didn't fully understand. The first rider went down when Titan crashed into his machine, metal crumpling under the Grizzly's weight. Jack took the second with a clean shot, the man tumbling into the snow, his weapon silenced. The third fled, engine roaring into the dark, but not before Titan lunged, tearing a chunk from the sled's frame. The Grizzly had collapsed then, blood pooling beneath it, and Jack had fired a final warning shot into the sky, the echo chasing the coward off. Now he followed the trail, his breath steaming in the crisp air. The ranger's radio call had been real. Backup was coming, but Jack couldn't wait. Titan's growls had guided him here, to a shallow cave carved into the mountainside, its entrance half hidden by snow-laden branches. He ducked inside, flashlight cutting through the gloom, and saw her, a woman young, maybe 30, curled against the rock, her dark hair matted with blood and ice. She clutched a tattered jacket, her eyes wide with fear, but alive. Beside her, Titan lay sprawled, its massive chest heaving, blood dripping from the bullet wound in its shoulder. "Anna?" Jack said, guessing from the note, his voice rough but steady. She nodded, trembling, and reached for Stella, tears streaking her face as Jack handed the baby over. "I'm Jack Malone," he said, kneeling beside Titan. "This big bastard brought her to me. Saved her life. And yours, looks like. Anna sobbed, clutching Stella, her words tumbling out in gasps. They killed my husband. Smugglers. Guns. I saw too much. Titan. It found me, kept me warm, fought them off. Jack's jaw tightened, the pieces snapping into place. Anna was a journalist, digging into a weapons ring running through the Sierra Nevada. Her husband had died in the ambush, and she'd fled with Stella, only to crash in the storm. Titan had stumbled onto them, saved the baby, then her, a guardian born of the wild. You're safe now, Jack said, his hand resting on Titan's flank, feeling the grizzly's ragged breaths. The bear's eyes met his, a flicker of recognition, and Jack nodded, a soldier's salute to a comrade. The Rangers arrived an hour later, their sleds roaring into the clearing. They took Anna and Stella to safety, patched Titan's wound with a vet's help, and scoured the wreck site, finding the husband's body and a cache of smuggled rifles buried nearby. The third rider's tracks led nowhere, vanished into the mountains, but Jack knew they'd be back. He didn't care. He'd signed up to protect, and he'd see it through. Anna begged him to take Stella while she recovered, and Jack agreed, Titan's steady gaze sealing the deal. 20 years passed like a whisper on the wind. Raven's Peak grew, but its wild heart stayed untamed, guarded by the legend of Titan, a grizzly that bridged man and nature in a night of fire and snow. Stella Malone grew tall and fierce, her dark eyes mirroring the bear that saved her. Jack raised her in the cabin, teaching her the mountains, the rifle, the grit of survival. Titan lived another decade, a scarred Titan roaming the ridges until it lay down one winter and didn't rise. Jack buried it on the peak, a cairn of stones marking its rest, and Stella wept, her first memory, a shadow of fur and strength against the storm. She took that memory and ran with it. At 23, Stella founded the Titan Foundation, a wildlife trust dedicated to understanding the bond between humans and the wild. She studied bears, tracked their patterns, and fought to protect the Sierra Nevada, her voice a clarion call in lecture halls and forest trails. They're more than animals, she'd say, her words echoing Jack's tales of that night. They feel, they know, they save. Her work bridged worlds, science and spirit, proving what Titan had shown her. Compassion wasn't just human, it was universal. Jack, gray and stooped, stood beside her now, watching from the ridge as she led a group of rangers through the pines. Stella paused, turning to the peak where Titan slept, and Jack followed her gaze. The sun caught a faint rainbow in the mist, arching over the valley, and he felt it, a whisper of the grizzly's presence, fierce and eternal. You did good, kid, he said, his voice thick, clapping her shoulder. Stella smiled, her hand brushing the bear claw pendant at her neck, a gift from Anna, who'd rebuilt her life as a writer, telling their story to the world. They stood there, man and woman, soldier and savior, bound by a night that defied reason. Below, the forest stretched wild and free, Titan's legacy alive in every rustle of leaves, every track in the snow. Stella turned to Jack, her eyes bright. He's still with us, isn't he? She said, and Jack nodded, feeling the mountain breathe around them. Always will be, he replied, and they walked on, two souls carrying a bear's gift into a future where nature and humanity stood as one.